the most deformed family in Alabama, racked by diseases of their own consanguinity. Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, concealed among isolated valleys and thick forests of Winston County, Alabama, there lived a family whose name still evokes chills in the local population. The Blackwoods weren't just known for their self-imposed isolation from the wider world, but also for the awful genetic legacy they bore for generations. This is the tale of how the intermingling of family blood resulted in the emergence of one of the most genetically deformed lineages ever recorded in American medical history during the 1950s. The Blackwood case emerged in April 1957 when a rural doctor, Dr. James Harrington, was summoned to attend to an emergency on a secluded property in the hills. What he discovered would permanently alter his perception of the limits of human degradation. On that roughly 40-acre property lived around 32 people, spread among 3 small wooden houses, all part of the same family tree. What I witnessed that day will haunt me for the remainder of my life, Dr. Harrington reported in his medical records, released later after his death in 1983. Children with withered limbs, adults with distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies that recurred in nearly all the younger family members. The Blackwood property was roughly 14 miles from the closest town in Winston County, a location so secluded that they seldom received visitors. Even mail carriers avoided the area, leaving mail in an improvised box on the main road. The family patriarch, Elijah Blackwood, then 67, was notorious for his hostility towards strangers and the strict control he held over his descendants. The Blackwoods lived off subsistence farming, growing corn, potatoes, and some vegetables on rocky and fertile land. They raised pigs and chickens, rarely visiting town to buy essential supplies. The isolation wasn't just geographic. It was also cultural and genetic, an isolation that had started 3 generations prior with the arrival of the first Blackwood to that region around 1880. Dr. Harrington was summoned to care for Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl who was in difficult labor. She was both granddaughter and niece to Elijah, the offspring of a union between his daughter and his own brother. The baby was born with severe malformations, including polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, microcephaly, abnormally small head, and congenital heart problems that resulted in its death just 48 hours after birth. This tragic occurrence was just the beginning for the discovery of an alarming case of family consanguinity that spanned at least 4 generations. The practice of marriages between close family members had become an unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods, which Elijah justified as a way to preserve the purity of the family blood and protect their lands from outsiders. The first investigation revealed that of the 32 family members, 27 displayed some form of physical or cognitive anomaly. Among the most frequent conditions were severe facial deformities, including underdeveloped jaws and malformations in the palate, reduced stature with adults rarely exceeding 5'3" in height, intellectual disability ranging from mild to severe, vision problems including partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of members, congenital heart diseases, and limb malformations such as fused or extra fingers. Dr. Harrington's notes describe William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, then 42 years old, as having an asymmetrical face with widely set eyes, a significantly underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal spinal curvature that made him appear significantly shorter than he really was. His wife, and also first cousin, Sarah Blackwood, presented coarse facial features with a widened and flattened nose, thick lips, and small, deep-set eyes. Out of the couple's 6 children, 4 presented severe intellectual disability, unable to form complete sentences even as adults. The most unsettling aspect, according to the doctor's reports, was how the family seemed to accept these conditions as normal. They don't view these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic, he wrote. When questioned about marriages between close relatives, Elijah responded with disconcerting naturalness that it has always been this way and always will be. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These dark tales of isolated communities reveal truths about our humanity that few have the courage to confront. You won't want to miss any of our next cases, documented with the same care and depth. The story of the Blackwoods gets darker when we examine their origins. Historical records show that the first Blackwood to arrive in that region was Isaiah Blackwood around 1880, fleeing accusations of unclarified crimes in the state of Tennessee. Isaiah brought with him his wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a small son, settling in the remote mountains of Winston County, deliberately seeking isolation. A local census from 1890 already showed that the family had expanded significantly, with 11 members living on the same property. What the records don't explicitly show, but which later investigations uncovered, is that this growth didn't just happen through the arrival of new members, but through the birth of children from relationships between the family members themselves. Letters found on the property dated 1910 show rejected mail from distant relatives who attempted to maintain contact, with handwritten responses by Isaiah. "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only bring corruption to our lineage." From the third generation, around 1920, the first clear signs of the genetic consequence of this practice started to emerge. Local medical records, though scarce due to the family's unwillingness to seek medical help, show births of children with increasingly severe malformations. Dr. Ernest Miller, a doctor who sometimes attended emergencies in the region in the 1930s, documented in his personal diary, "I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child presented a condition I had never seen before. Multiple malformations in the limbs and face, and an almost animal-like behavior from the mother, who refused to let me properly examine the newborn. The child's father, who I found out was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of atypical facial development." The Great Depression of the 1930s only deepened the isolation of the Blackwoods. While many rural families in Alabama were forced to migrate to urban centers seeking work, the Blackwoods entrenched themselves even more on their property, surviving through subsistence farming and hunting. This period also marked the start of Elijah's leadership, who seized control of the family following his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's rule, the practices of consanguineous union not only persisted but were actively encouraged. Local school records show that the few Blackwood children who did attend the county school in the 1940s were pulled out after just a few months. A teacher from that era, Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, noted in school reports, "The Blackwood children show significant trouble in learning and socialization. Furthermore, they present distinctive physical characteristics that make them targets of ridicule by their peers." After complaints from Elijah Blackwood about the treatment his children and nephews received, the children stopped attending. The isolation wasn't just a matter of personal preference, but also a reaction to growing stigmatization. Residents of the area developed an almost superstitious dread of the Blackwoods, with exaggerated tales about their appearances and behaviors spreading throughout the county. Deformed creatures living in the mountains, or the cursed people of the hills, were terms often used to refer to the family. In 1945, a major incident happened when two young Blackwoods, Joseph and Daniel, cousins and also half-brothers, went to town to buy supplies. Their appearance caused such a stir that they were chased out of the local grocery store by terrified customers. The local sheriff, Thomas Walsh, recorded the incident. The boys showed no aggressive behavior, just an extremely odd appearance, eyes set very far apart, protruding jaws, and a form of communication almost impossible to understand between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to prevent further confrontations. This event only hardened Elijah's resolve to keep his family totally isolated from the outside world. In the following years, between 1945 and 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, with the exception of Elijah and his oldest son, Robert, who occasionally went down to buy essential items like salt, ammunition, and tools. World War II, which drove many young men from Alabama to enlist or be drafted, did not directly impact the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly due to their physical and intellectual limitations, and partly due to their invisibility in official records. Many births and deaths within the family were never officially registered, creating a phantom population that existed on the fringes of American society. It was in this context of extreme isolation, social stigmatization, and consanguineous marriage practices established for generations that Dr. Harrington found the family in 1957, when he was called to help in the complicated birth of Martha Blackwood. When Dr. James Harrington went back to town after his first contact with the Blackwoods, he found himself facing an ethical and professional quandary. As a doctor, he instantly recognized the classic characteristics of a population with a high incidence of consanguinity. But he also realized he was facing an extreme case that could significantly add to medical knowledge. about the genetic consequences of these practices. After discreetly consulting with colleagues from the University of Alabama, Harrington won the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar cases, though less severe, in isolated communities in Europe. In June 1957, 2 months after the initial incident, the two doctors went back to the Blackwood property, this time with a carefully planned strategy. "We couldn't just arrive and state our study's intentions," wrote Thompson in his later report. "We approached by offering free medical help and medications, knowing the family had little or no access to regular health care. Initially hostile, Elijah Blackwood eventually permitted the doctors to examine some family members, especially after realizing that his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that weren't healing properly. This opening, though limited, allowed the doctors to start what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated population in the United States. Over 3 later visits, always under the guise of medical follow-up, the doctors managed to gather crucial data: partial medical histories of 27 family members, anthropometric measurements of 19 individuals, photographic documentation with reluctant permission of 12 members, blood samples from 8 people for basic laboratory tests. The technological limits of the time did not permit the sophisticated genetic tests we have today. But even with basic methods, the findings were alarming. Blood analyses revealed high levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes, inherited from both parents, a clear indicator of consanguinity. "What we are witnessing in the Blackwoods," wrote Dr. Thompson in his 1957 notes, "is a dramatic amplification of recessive traits that would normally stay dormant in populations with more genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, creating a cascade effect that resulted in the severe physical and cognitive manifestations we have documented. Among the specific conditions they identified were Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, present in at least 6 members, polydactyly, extra digits, in 11 individuals, intellectual disability in approximately 70% of the family, ranging from mild to profound, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members, hemophilia in 3 men of the family, retinitis pigmentosa, progressive degeneration of the retina, in almost 40% of individuals. The study also revealed an alarming infant mortality rate. Approximately 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not survive beyond the first year of life. Those who survived often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout childhood. One of the most striking cases documented was that of Samuel Blackwood, 19 years old, son of William and Sarah. The young man presented a rare combination of conditions: severe microcephaly, extremely underdeveloped jaw, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to perceiving light and shadow, and a stature that did not surpass 4'7". Despite these physical limitations, Samuel showed surprising musical talents, being able to reproduce complex melodies on the banjo after hearing them only once. Cases like Samuel's represent the complexity of human genetics, Thompson observed. Even in conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression. During one of the visits, Dr. Harrington managed to have a deeper dialogue with Abigail Blackwood, 52 years old, Elijah's sister and one of the few people in the family who had had significant contact with the outside world in her youth. Abigail revealed that when she was young, she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville, coming back to the family property only when her father became ill. "They don't know what they're doing to themselves," she confided to the doctor. "I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within. Have you ever wondered what secrets isolated families hide on their remote properties? Leave in the comments. The mountains hold truths that society prefers to ignore. Your participation helps us continue bringing these impactful stories that few have the courage to tell. In August 1957, the doctors presented their preliminary findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, keeping the family's anonymity for ethical reasons, referring to them only as Family X from northern Alabama. The presentation sparked considerable interest in the regional medical community, but also raised ethical questions about intervention. We are facing a population that voluntarily isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for subsequent generations, argued Dr. Thompson during the conference. As health professionals, do we have an obligation to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy even when it results in severe genetic damage? The autumn of 1957 marked a turning point in the Blackwoods' history. After the presentation at the medical conference, the case drew the discreet attention of public health authorities from the state of Alabama. The state health department, worried with the implications of the case, sent a small multidisciplinary team to evaluate the situation, including a social worker, a public health nurse, and a legal representative. The arrival of these authorities at the Blackwood property in October 1957 was met with open hostility. Elijah, holding a shotgun, initially refused to let them onto the property. The intervention of Dr. Harrington, who had earned a minimum of trust from the family, was needed to mediate the situation. "You have no right to meddle in how we live," Elijah yelled at the team, as later reported. "Our land, our rules. We've been here for 3 generations and nobody ever cared about us before." The public health team documented precarious living conditions in the 3 houses on the property. Absence of running water or electricity, rudimentary sanitary facilities that contaminated the family's water well, and general hygiene conditions that worsened existing health problems. 5 school-aged children received no form of formal education, and several family members presented treatable medical conditions that had been ignored for years. The official report by social worker Margaret Collins described, "We found a family living in conditions that go back a century, both in material terms and social practices. The children show clear signs of chronic malnutrition, aggravating the congenital conditions already present. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases such as severe dental infections and chronic respiratory problems without any medical intervention." The situation put the authorities before a complex dilemma. On one hand, there were clear violations of child welfare and public health laws. On the other, forced intervention could traumatize an already fragile and isolated community. After intense deliberations, the health department chose a gradual approach, starting with offers of immediate medical help and education before considering more drastic measures. However, unforeseen events sped up the intervention process. In November 1957, a strong storm hit the region, causing a landslide that partially destroyed one of the houses on the property. 2 family members were seriously injured and taken to the county hospital, marking the first time many of the younger Blackwoods had left the family property. This incident gave authorities an opportunity to intervene more directly. While the injured received care, social workers were able to talk with other family members who went with them to the hospital, including 3 teenagers who showed curiosity about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16 years old, with less severe facial deformities than other family members, but with mild intellectual disability, expressed her wish to properly learn to read. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker, "but I want to know things that are in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what's written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some younger family members, combined with the practical need for help after the landslide, created a breach in the isolation the family had kept for decades. In December 1957, an agreement was reached. The county would offer materials to rebuild the damaged house and ongoing medical assistance in exchange for permission for the school-aged children to get basic education from a teacher who would visit the property 3 times a week. Elijah reluctantly agreed, mainly due to pressure from other adult family members who had glimpsed the benefits of contact with the outside world after the landslide incident. This small concession marked the start of a slow transformation. The designated teacher, Esther Jenkins, an experienced educator of 58 who had worked with isolated rural communities throughout her career, started her visits in January 1958. Her personal diary, later donated to the County Historical Archive, offers an intimate glimpse of this process. "My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge like no other in my 30 years of teaching. 5 children between 7 and 16 years old, non-literate, all with some degree of cognitive and physical disability. But what struck me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world that had been denied to them. Little Timothy, 9 years old, with his extra fingers and asymmetrical face, spent almost an hour fascinated with a globe I brought. Are we really so small in the world? He asked, with eyes wide with astonishment. Throughout 1958, the regular presence of Teacher Jenkins and occasional visits from health professionals started to have a noticeable impact. 3 of the children learned to read at a basic level. Chronic medical conditions were treated, and gradually Elijah's initial hostility lessened, although he kept his mistrust of the outside world. A significant turning point happened in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose complicated birth had started the whole discovery process, expressed her desire to leave the property and seek treatment for her persistent health conditions. At 17 years old and now literate thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's classes, Martha had developed an understanding that her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer as we have suffered," Martha told Dr. Harrington during a consultation. "If what you say is true about our problems coming from marriages between relatives, then I need to leave here." Martha's decision to leave the property, along with 2 teenage cousins, sparked a crisis in the family. Elijah initially threatened to use force to stop them, but the intervention of the local sheriff and the mediation of Dr. Harrington led to a tense agreement. The young women would be allowed to leave as long as they stayed under the supervision of social workers and kept regular contact with the family. This event marked the start of the gradual dissolution of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations. In the following years, between 1958 and 1965, more than half of the younger family members chose to leave the property, many seeking medical treatment for their conditions in specialized institutions or integrating to the extent possible into the broader society. The early 1960s saw profound changes in the history of the Blackwoods. The property that had been an isolated enclave for almost 80 years started to slowly open to the outside world. Elijah Blackwood, the inflexible patriarch, faced not only the loss of his absolute authority, but also a reality that contradicted everything he had believed for decades. In January 1962, Elijah suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and dependent on care, a situation ironically symbolic for a man who had valued independence and isolation so much. Under the care of his sister Abigail and with regular medical help now available, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at the age of 77. During these last years of life, Elijah witnessed transformations that he certainly saw as the destruction of his way of life. William, his eldest son, took leadership of the family and, influenced by new ideas brought by health professionals and educators, started to implement significant changes on the property. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, getting basic plumbing and electricity in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year, letting vehicles reach the property even during periods of heavy rain. The younger children started to attend the local school, though with special support due to their specific needs. Dr. Walter Thompson, who had started his studies with the family in 1957, kept following the case of the Blackwoods for over 2 decades. In 1972, he published a seminal article in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled Multi-Generational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama. The article, which kept the family's anonymity using the pseudonym Alpha Family, meticulously documented the genetic effects seen over 5 generations. Thompson's work became a reference in the field of population genetics, contributing significantly to the scientific understanding of the effects of prolonged inbreeding in human populations. Among the most significant findings documented by Thompson were the progressively more severe expression of recessive genetic conditions with each generation, the emergence of rare combinations of conditions that are rarely seen in populations with greater genetic diversity, the dramatic reduction in fertility and viability of births in recent generations, the occurrence of unexpected characteristics in some individuals, such as specific talents amid widespread disabilities. The study also documented the improvement in general health and development of the younger family members after the 1957-58 intervention. Children who got adequate nutrition, medical care, and education showed better cognitive and physical development compared to their older siblings and cousins, showing the powerful impact of environmental factors even in cases of significant genetic predisposition. A particularly notable aspect was the follow-up of the young women who left the property in 1958. Martha Blackwood, whose difficult birth experience had started the entire process, eventually settled in Birmingham, where she got treatment for her medical conditions and learned basic sewing skills. Although never able to live completely independently due to her limitations, she found purpose working in a craft program for people with disabilities. In an interview given to a local newspaper in 1975, Martha, then 34, reflected on her journey. "I was born in a place where we didn't know there was another way to live. We thought we were as we should be. Now I understand that much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my parents or grandparents. They did what they believed was right. But I'm happy that our story can help other people understand the risks of this kind of isolation." Other Blackwood children and young adults who got educational and medical intervention had varied outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were eventually placed in specialized institutions when their family caregivers aged. Others achieved surprising levels of social integration, especially those who had been exposed to education earlier. The Blackwood property slowly decreased in population. Of the 32 members who lived there when Dr. Harrington made his first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. The land, which had been kept isolated for so long, was partially sold to neighboring farmers, with a small central portion still occupied by descendants of the family. The case of the Blackwoods had ramifications beyond the immediate family. In the 1970s, it influenced public health policies in rural areas of Alabama, with specific programs being developed to identify and offer help to isolated communities. Health professionals received training to recognize signs of consanguinity and address the issue in a culturally sensitive manner with affected communities. In medical schools across the southern United States, the case study of the Blackwoods, always presented with pseudonyms, became part of the medical genetics curriculum, dramatically illustrating the risks of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Thompson often commented that the story of the Blackwoods is both a lesson in genetics and a lesson in humility for medicine. A reminder that entire communities can exist on the margins of our health systems, facing suffering that could be mitigated with proper intervention. In 1980, a team of documentarians from the University of Alabama received permission from William Blackwood, then 65 and the last of Elijah's children still alive, to create a historical and educational record about the family. The documentary, titled Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, was produced with sensitivity, maintaining the family's anonymity and focusing on the medical and social aspects of the case instead of exploiting the sensationalism of the physical deformities. The film, shown only in educational and medical contexts, included interviews with professionals who worked with the family and some members of the Blackwoods who agreed to participate. One of the most eloquent participants was Rachel Blackwood, then 39, who had become an informal advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the strange, the different," she said before the cameras, her face with distinctive features but undeniable dignity. "They don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, dreams, fears. What happened to our family is a tragedy that could have been avoided with knowledge and support. I hope others can learn from our experience." The genetic legacy of the Blackwoods continued, though in a diluted form, in subsequent generations. The younger members who left the property and eventually formed families did so with unrelated partners, resulting in a rapid decline in the incidence of severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study done by Dr. Thompson in 1985, shortly before his retirement, documented 43 direct descendants of the Blackwoods living in various parts of Alabama. Of these, about 30% presented mild to moderate genetic conditions, a dramatic reduction compared to the almost 85% seen in the previous generation. The case of the Blackwoods, wrote Thompson in his final conclusions, demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of the human genome. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we observed significant improvements in the health and development of descendants. However, certain conditions persist, reminding us of the lasting impact that consanguinity practices can have across generations. The original Blackwood property, reduced to less than 10 acres, remained occupied until 1992, when the last resident, Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62 years old. The land was sold, and the original structures, deteriorated by time, were eventually demolished. Today, few physical signs remain of the site that housed one of the most documented stories of family consanguinity in the United States. Visiting the site where the Blackwood property once stood today is a silent experience. The mountains and forests remain indifferent to the human drama that unfolded there for decades. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the site with a simple text. On this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity. The last known descendants of the Blackwoods are now dispersed, many having adopted new surnames and integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some kept contact with each other, united by bonds of kinship and shared experiences that few outsiders could fully understand. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of the initial discovery of the family by Dr. Harrington, the University of Alabama School of Medicine held a symposium on genetic isolation and public health, lessons learned and future challenges. Among the speakers was Michael Thompson, son of Dr. Walter Thompson, and also a geneticist who had inherited his father's research files. The case of the Blackwoods is not just medical history, he stated during the event. It's a study on how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies. It's also a story about how compassionate intervention can alter trajectories that seemed inevitable. 50 years later, we are still extracting valuable lessons from this remarkable family. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwoods is educational. Their experiences, which were documented with scientific and ethical care, are still teaching new generations of health professionals about consanguinity's impacts, the importance of genetic diversity, and the difficulties of providing aid to isolated communities. The Blackwoods story also confronts us with profound questions regarding cultural autonomy versus human welfare, regarding the limits of isolation in a modern society, and regarding how practices established for generations can result in unintended and devastating consequences. For the few who know their complete history, the Blackwoods are remembered not only for the physical deformities that made them objects of medical study, but also for the human resilience they showed in facing extraordinary circumstances and for the courage of those who, like Martha and Rachel, ventured to question established traditions and seek a different path. In a very real sense, the most deformed family in Alabama provides us not just a case study on the dangers of consanguinity, but also a mirror where we can examine our own attitudes toward those who are different, our prejudices and fears, and our collective ability both to inflict suffering and to relieve it through knowledge, understanding, and compassion. If you're still watching, it means you enjoyed this story. Post a comment saying, "I watched it all the way through," so I can get to know you and see who truly enjoys the stories here on the channel. Remember to also leave your like to support our work and share this video with others who are also interested in these true stories that expose dark aspects of the human condition. Subscribe to the channel right now so you won't miss any of our future investigations into extraordinary cases just like this one.